Hello and welcome to the Anthrozoology Podcast. My name's Chris and I earned my PhD in Anthrozoology from Exeter University in 2023. My main research focuses on cat-human relations and discourses surrounding roaming cats.
Hi, my name's Sarah and I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Exeter looking at shark-human relationships. I'm also interested in feline lives in Saudi Arabia, specifically abandoned cats.
And I'm Michelle. My PhD is in anthrozoology, and my research focuses on pachyderm human relationships in the contexts of tourism work, One Health, One Welfare, and conservation.
So in this episode, we continue our special series on the history and future of the field of anthrozoology. Today, we are joined by Dr. Aubrey Fine. Dr. Aubrey Fine is a native of Montreal, Canada, and the author of numerous books on the human-animal bond, family dynamics, and animal-assisted therapies. He received his graduate degree from the University of Cincinnati in 1982 and opened his psychology practice in 1987. His practice specializes in treating children with ADHD and learning disabilities, developmental disorders, and parent-child relations. Dr. Fine has been on the faculty at California State Polytechnic University since 1981 and is presently a professor emeritus as well as a licensed psychologist. So Aubrey's primary research interests relate to the psychosocial impact of human-animal interactions and animal-assisted interventions, social skills training, and children with ADHD and resilience in children. So welcome and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to this chat.
So perhaps you could begin by telling us a little bit about your career, what inspired you, any challenges along the way, etc.
Everyone has ups and downs, I guess, but really, I'm at the tail end of my work experience, although I never really felt I've ever worked a day. So, one of my themes is how do you make a life, not a living? And this has been a true joy as part of my journey, because really I'm a human psychologist, right? I grew up in Canada without a pet. I always like to let people know that never had animals in my life. Was brought up by a mother who was very afraid of animals, didn't like them. And she would be the kind of parent that when we would be walking on a street and there might be a dog, she'd say, let's go to the other side, or really make us very uncomfortable about animals. And who would have thought years later that I'd live a life of Dr. Dolittle, so to speak, but instead of being able to talk to animals, although I do talk to them all the time, I've learned to talk through them. And so my whole life in animal-assisted interventions has been very serendipitous. So I, probably the greatest joy in my profession was combining both the clinical work, writing, and research in relationship to humans and animals and the benefits of animals in our lives. I've not only learned about that professionally, but I've learned about that very personally in growing up as an adult and as a parent and as a grandparent of many animals with sharing them with my family. So in addition to the animal assisted interventions and specializing in children, I'm also a diplomat in sports psychology. So I also had worked with athletes as well. So I'm excited to talk about what you're interested in, and we'll see where this journey will take us.
Well, before we jump in too far, can you maybe just explain a little bit about what you mean by talking to animals and talking through animals?
That's a good question. So let me give you an example. Let me walk your listeners back to one of my early stories about animal-assisted interventions. And I got involved before this was really a field. Okay, so Boris Levinson, and that many of your listeners would have heard about, Samuel Corson. They began doing this work in the mid-60s. Okay, so one of the first books that came out was in the late 60s, early 70s. And I got involved in animal-assisted interventions, although it wasn't called that for sure, in 1973. So my first pet was a gerbil, and her name was Sasha. I still remember, she really wasn't my first pet. She was actually the second, because when I brought home the animal that I thought was going to be my first pet, it was a little mouse. And I brought the mouse and was going to put it in her house. I'll do a little Dr. Zeus for you. And right when I came in, my mother started screaming, "It's a rat, it's a rat." And she got so nervous and so anxious. I got concerned. So I said, you know what? This is not the right time. So I went back to the store that I got the mouse and I said, I don't want a refund. I'm going to keep the cage. I'm going to keep all the stuff I have, but I'll come back in about a month, 3-4 weeks after I get my mother a little bit calmer, and I'll get this mouse again. But when I went to get the mouse, I saw a little animal that I didn't know what it was, but it was a gerbil. It was a different kind of rodent that I really was attracted to, and so she was my first pet. And so you asked the question, how did I learn about this to begin with? Well, when I brought Sasha to a program, I had designed a program. This is 1973 for kids in those days that were diagnosed as having learning disabilities. But in 1973, that term was used for so many other diagnostic terms that we'd have today. So children in that group had ADHD, had perhaps high functioning autism, Tourette's syndrome, oppositional defiance, lots of kids. And so I remember coming an afternoon to the program. It was in the cold of Canadian winter, carrying a little cage with my little buddy Sasha, who I now had probably in my life about 9 months to a year. She was so sweet. And when I came in, I had no intention. She was going to be my share with this group of youngsters, except I was the coordinator. Lots of kids were there. And I was greeted by lots of children that asked many, many questions, like, what kind of animal was that? Why was I carrying an animal in a cage, especially in the cold of winter? And then a couple of kids said, hey, could I hold her? And I said, well, not yet. But one boy was really persistent. Today, he would have been diagnosed as a youngster that had ADHD. And I said to him, sure. I said, let's go over here, sit on down. He sat down, he crossed his legs, and I said, I want you to hold your palms together, put them on your tummy, and I'll move this so you can get an idea. Put them about here so that Sasha feels nice and secure. But then I looked at him and I said, but you have to promise me one thing. You have to promise me you're not going to move because I don't want to scare my little friend. So he said he was ready, and I put Sasha in his palms, and as she got more comfortable, she meandered on his tummy, then went back to his palms. And then the boy's eyes were just beaming with pride and joy. And then he looked at me, and this is 51 years ago, actually, 1973. So I don't remember all the details, but I do remember a little boy looking at me saying, I promised you I wouldn't move. And he didn't. So that serendipitous began my awareness of the value of this very unique connection. So over the course of 51 years of clinically working with children and animals, I've learned to sort of dance with my animals, so to speak, that we become a seamless team and that we communicate with children. Sometimes they do the lead, sometimes I'm the secondary, and we're able to connect. So when I use the word, I learned to talk through animals, my whole presence when I work clinically with, in my case, children, primarily children and teenagers, they see us together. We communicate together. Sometimes the animals will sit right next to you. Sometimes they'll snuggle next to you. Sometimes we'll do things together. But so my way of working with them is that commentary that I've learned to talk through them. Although on the other hand, I have talked through them. You know, I do puppetry with children, and I have puppets that look exactly like my therapy animals. My therapy animals have written letters, probably over the last 5 decades. If I say hundreds of them, I wouldn't be lying. Letters that are very therapeutic, letters that talk about bullying, talk about feeling discouraged, letters of encouragement to build resilience. So, but the letters come from them, and you know, the kids know that it's from me, but yet they get very charmed about that whole process. So it was a good question. I've never really been asked, what did I mean exactly like that? But I think you're getting the idea now.
So I had a question, if you don't mind. So I was listening to a couple of your podcasts that you've got on YouTube, and you say that you work alongside the animals. They're not tools. You mentioned. You call them co-therapists, and I really like that aspect. I did have a question about the use of the word pet. Obviously, the use of the word pet is becoming more unpopular in literature, and the use of the word companion animal is becoming more popular. And I wondered if you had any thoughts around the boundaries of which species, in your experience, people think can be pets, can be companion animals, people can have relationships with, especially. And again, you mentioned that you use social media on one of the podcasts, that you look at social media. There's a lot more unconventional relationships at the moment on social media. So what are your thoughts around, there's no perfect answer, but what are your thoughts around these different relationships that are coming out of social media and the word pet and companion animals?
Sure. I get that question a lot from different folks. Many years ago, Irv Robin, who's a big American ice cream person, once said with him and his partner, Baskin, that I have lots of flavors of ice cream. Not every flavor of ice cream that I have is an individual's favorite, but I know I have something that everyone will like. You know, you're probably saying or scratching your head, but you're not scratching your heads right now. What is he talking about when he's talking about ice cream? And I'm talking about companion animals. So even in my own clinical work, I have diversity in the animals that I worked alongside with. So I've had dogs and I've had rabbits. I've worked with exotic birds, big and small. I've had one of my favorite lizards, a bearded dragon. I've had fish tanks. You already heard about Sasha, the gerbil. I've had guinea pigs. So my question is that for different people, they find, if I can use an unconventional non-research term, they find love in different places, and then they connect. So I've met people that have told me they've had connections with their chickens. I've had a young person that lived on a farm that used to read every day lying next to her cow. There are people that have horses. I giggle because one of my dearest friends is an Arabian horse that I went to do a photo shoot with over a decade ago. And I felt horrible when I did the pictures. I was speaking at a conference and they wanted me with horses, and my university was endowed by Mr. Kellogg of Battle Creek. It was his Arabian horse village. So I always went by the horses. Intermittently, I would go over and maybe give a treat to a horse, but that was it. So there was the day I went to visit to take these pictures, and they had her all dressed up in this Arabian outfit. And I felt, first of all, I looked at a student, I said, could I borrow your pair? Because she had a snack. And I said, because I don't have any snacks, I got to figure out how to get her to want to take this picture. The horse took a bite, but I'm not greedy. I went back to the student and said, well, here's your pair back. Of course, she didn't really want it after the horse had bitten into it. But after we did the photo shoot, I looked at the students and said, I'll be back. And I'm sure they've heard that 1,000 times, right? I'm sure they've heard from people that took pictures of these horses that they'd come back, and they didn't. But I did. And I visit her 2-3 times a week. We walk together. I brush her. My wife calls her my good friend. I've been there for the birth of 5 of her foals over the years. And I'm the most consistent human in her life. When you think about it, people come and go all the time. So I'm answering your question with a different response. Part of the process of relationships with animals is the connection that's developed. That being said, there are some people, and I think that was what you were alluding to, that some people have develop unique relationships with companion animals that one wouldn't consider companion animals. And that becomes more of this aha thing that then gets a lot of attention in the media. I think there was a story recently about a person that adopted an alligator in the United States, and I was asked to comment on that, and I didn't get a chance to do that. But the reality is, I think mainstream has an idea of what is conventionally appropriate. And some people would say, for example, well, how do you connect with a lizard? Or how do you connect with a bird, for example? But many of my birds over the years, as being members of our family, but also working with children, snuggle, they interact really very favorably. I think it's important to appreciate that what we're really looking at are connections. Now, I could take it a step further, that people have this tremendous curiosity to wildlife. I heard that you were interested in sharks, for example, but think of ecotourism and people interested in going to the Arctic to see polar bears, or to go to Africa and visit these tremendous animals like elephants. And I've done both. In fact, I went all the way to Africa, and I ended up writing a story that was Follow the Yellow Brick Road, It Leads Home. I went to Africa to figure out why I loved animals, went all those thousands of miles, loved every animal that I met. But on the other hand, I realized it was my animal friends at home that really were my true conviction. So I think it saddens me a little bit, if I can be honest, that sometimes social media sometimes over sensationalizes some of these very important connections. And I think connections are connections. And so I've been blessed over the years with so many wonderful relationships that I personally have had with so many animals that I've called family members, friends. But there's that mutual respect that they are sentient beings. They're not humans with fur or feathers or lizard skin. So you have to appreciate that non-human animals are exactly that. So anthropomorphic thinking is valuable because it allows us the ability to want to connect with others, to be curious about the way they live. But my dogs are dogs. And so they hang out as dogs, they run and maybe get into the muck, and then I might have to clean them if we're going to go to work. But the reality is, I've always learned to respect that. And so I think that's the important issue of animal companionship in general. Taking Irv Robin's comment that I have many different flavors and everyone's going to like at least one of them. I'm not saying that animals are ice cream flavors. Don't misunderstand that at all. But even in my own clinical work, when I was really involved, because I'm mainly retired now, there on a given day, I could have 3 or 4 therapy dogs. I'd have 1 or 2 cockatoos. I might have a lovebird or a conure. The bunny might come over. The bearded dragon was there. And in fact, I had lots and lots of fish. In fact, I had several aquariums, saltwater, freshwater. And if I want to be childish, I had one fish. I remember this years ago. It was a I'm blocking the name. Her name, I named her Big Jaggers because she had very large lips, and she was such a beautiful fish. But she developed an infection in her eye, and when I phoned the my aquatics specialist, he said, there's not much we can do. His suggestion was to put her down, and I said, well, she just can't see that well, but she could survive. And so for about 6 months, while at work, and kids always love this, they got a chance to see me hand feed her. I would put my hand in this very large, tall aquarium, and she would come to my hand. No one else would fuss with it, and I'd hand feed her. And in fact, the day she died in my hand, and I took her home with me. So again, different reasons why we connect, and we could talk a little bit about the relationships that are established with non-human animals, because in so many ways, there's a very unique aspect. Again, when you asked that question to me earlier about talking through them, sometimes we don't even talk with each other, but we look at each other, we touch each other, we sit next to each other. And sometimes it's not on my terms, it's on their terms. How many times have I go to visit a horse and Amber's busy chewing some grass in the pasture? She sees me, sort of gives me a nod from the distance, but she may meander down 10 or 15 minutes later. I love it when I could tell you that she runs to me from the pasture when she sees me, and she does that many a time. But on the other hand, sometimes it's on her terms, and you know what? That's okay. And that's what you call a mutual respectful relationship, that it isn't always on our terms. We want to take our companion animal for a walk, but if the companion animal doesn't want to go for a walk, do we say that's okay? So it's important for us to recognize all of those issues. So I don't know if I answered your question, but I think I did.
Yeah, you did, for sure. And it was really lovely to hear you say that people who have relationships with not unconventional other than human animals is respected, because so many times I was thinking the other day, we use this term disenfranchised grief, but they're almost disenfranchised relationships, because how could you possibly connect with a snake? How could you possibly connect with a shark? How could you possibly connect with a gecko or a bearded dragon or something? It's very nice to see. Thank you very much.
You know, it's funny when you mentioned the bearded dragon, I always laugh because I had a veterinarian in my part of California that knew me. So sometimes she would contact me to rehab some animals. And I never forgot, she called me and said, well, I have this bearded dragon, the first bearded dragon that I had, and it was abused, so its tail was cut off. So the store couldn't sell her. And so the long story short, she said, would you mind taking the bearded dragon? I have a little cage for you, I have everything. So there was this little bearded dragon about this small that I picked up, and I said, oh, this is going to be fun. I've never had a bearded dragon before. And what was interesting, it was probably only a few days later, I had a boy that came in, and she was in the office with me, and he said, oh, Dr. Fine, I didn't realize you like bearded dragons. And I go, well, I'm learning. He said, well, I have one. Could I bring it? Bring him or her. And I said, sure. And he'd forgotten. A couple of weeks went by, but all of a sudden one day he came in with this big cardboard box. And he had a big smile on his face. And so I said, well, what's in the box? Was it a toy? Was it a magic trick? And then he proceeded, he says, don't you remember I told you I was going to bring my friend? And then I had to think a bit, and I said, sure. And then he takes out a full-grown adult bearded dragon. So again, mine was this small, his was this big, and I'm looking going, oh my goodness, Godzilla's here. And I turned white like a ghost. Meanwhile, that bearded dragon was terrific. She worked well with kids. In fact, I remember she once had an infection that was showing in her eye, but it was really a glandular infection that I knew. And one vet said, this is costly to treat. Have you ever thought of just, maybe replacing her for someone else? And I said, but there's only one of her, and her name was Spikey, and that's who I want to keep. And Spikey was wonderful. With some of the children that I worked on that were abused, she was an easy way to talk about abuse, because they'd look at her and they'd say, well, what's wrong with her tail? And we would talk, and so that's how I could talk through her, because then she was telling the story and then the kids related to that. One of the problems that Spikey had, and she was on a tremendous diet. We didn't feed her always the crickets and the high proteins. I also mixed it up with fruits and vegetables, and kids would help with that. But periodically, in fact, I giggle because sometimes I try to sneak kale into the lettuce, and she never liked kale, but kale's good for her. And all of a sudden you'd see her picking through the stuff, and then she'd look at me, she'd have a little kale in her mouth, and I'm being anthropomorphic, but she'd spit it out. It was really quite funny. But the part that I wanted to lead to, again, there was this animal that had been abused. the other part that she had is that she was always, as she aged, she started to develop chronic constipation. And it's easy to treat that, you can give some oils, but if you put her in a warm bath of water and rub her back or her side, she'll end up going to the bathroom. Well, I treat a lot of kids that have encopresis. Encopresis is soiling difficulties. And an easy way to get to that topic without presenting it in a certain way is that sometimes kids would come and I'd say, Spikey's having a little bit of an issue right now. And if you don't mind, I'm just going to help her for a minute and you can sit here. And I would put her in that little warm Tupperware container with warm water. And then I would just kind of make her feel comfortable. And then she would relieve herself. And then kids would look at me and go, she has the same problem I do. And then we talk about how do we go through that process. So again, yeah, she was a wonderful, wonderful companion. And I had her she lived a long time, in fact, much longer than one would have assumed. But that was partially because she had a very good diet. And in fact, all of the animals that I work with, they're probably in some ways healthier than I am because I work with nutritionists to balance what they eat or do. But let's continue on with your questions. I digressed a bit.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Can I ask, or did you want to go next, Michelle?
No, go ahead.
Yeah, I guess it's kind of leads on a little bit. Yes, so I mean, it's so important to have somebody there, the adult that sort of can sort of account for both the child and the animal's well-being. And I digress a little bit. I remember one of my earliest memories, my dad had a Great Dane called Dainty, who was there before I was born. And one of my earliest memories was getting told off for upsetting the dog because she was fast asleep. And I ran and jumped on her and I think she snapped. And I remember getting sat down in like a serious sort of telling, how would you like it if you jumped on the dog? And and then I felt bad because I'd upset the dog. But kind of digressing a little bit there, but it sort of leads into some of these worrying social media videos that sort of do the rounds, and it's almost like the person filming it is unaware, and some of them are quite worrying. You see kids grabbing a dog or chasing a cat, and you can see the animal's distressed, and the kid is and they're just thinking it's cute. And I saw one even when the dog actually did a warning snap at the toddler, and they were just filming. And it's like, how do you react to that sort of thing? It's I don't know. I mean, it's about educating people, right? And it's
learning to be conscious of or cognizant of both ends of the leash, if I can use the leash being both sides of the coin. I was interested in animal welfare before this was even a popular topic in regards to therapy animals. I know people have been interested in animal welfare for so many years, but the reality is, in the work that I do, it isn't only about the humans that come to visit. Everyone needs to be safe, and everyone needs to have agency in making choices. And so, I've been interested in what today we would call animal welfare therapy animals for decades. And I put that as being a priority. I think what you were talking about with companion animals is a tremendous comment years ago. And I think it's called Stop the 77, but it may be the 76. I'm not exactly sure. But if you look it up, it's a wonderful video clip that you can see that has a couple of vignettes of animals, and actually the animal is the one that's doing the talking, and basically it said, she would ride me like a pony, or she would dress me up like a fairy princess, or would tease me sometimes with my food, but all of a sudden it says, I didn't like it, and everyone that was around me didn't understand that I was telling them, can you just stop? Now, I know that for some of your listeners that might look at this, and eventually we might talk about research and science, would say, well, how does this relate to science? But when you look at what I call normal consumers, normal folks that believe that their lives are enriched and blessed by having non-human animals in their home with them, they do need to realize that these beings are not humans, again, with fur or feathers. They have their own way of living. They're sentient beings, and we have to respect that. So recognizing that maybe the animal doesn't want to be dressed up all the time. During COVID, for example, we saw lots of people adopting various species of animals. The interesting part is everyone saying, let's go take Fido for a walk. And in fact, Fido could get walked that day by every member of the family. And sometimes the dog's hiding, going, no, I don't want to do this. So the issue of agency is important. But your point of not paying attention is something that I wrote about in a book called Our Faithful Companions. When you adopt animals, you got to think about your lifestyle. You got to figure out how that companion animal fits into your daily life. You got to be able to realize that these beings aren't disposable. It always frustrated me that when you get a companion animal, one should think about this as a lifelong commitment that sometimes ends with a lot of emotion of sadness. We could talk about, people have always asked me, why do you do it? Why, when you have your dog or your cat or your bird or your bearded dragon pass away, why do you go back and do it again? And sure, it's painful. Grief is very difficult, but grief is the price you pay for in loving someone that's special, because that shows you that meaning. And so, no one's replaceable. And I always tell people that the animals that I've lost over the years, when I remember them, they still live. They still live on, and we celebrate that life. So I think I really appreciated your point. And so in Our Faithful Companions, I spend time talking to parents about exactly what you talked about. How do we sort of become conscious if we adopt animals into our family, to give animals safe places? So if an animal goes to a safe spot, that means we don't want to interact with them. They don't want us to interact with them. You might say, hey, do you want to play? Or do you want to hang out? It's important for us to recognize that when kids hang on animals, and we take our photos, right? We take our photos, but we're not being conscious of perhaps what that animal is telling us non-verbally, either by sometimes, lots of dogs bark or growl, but they're not biting. They're telling you, back off. Now, some animals don't do that early enough to give us that sign. So I think it's an important question that you brought up.
Thank you so much for joining us today on the Anthrozoology Podcast, and thank you to our special guest, Dr. Aubrey Fine. References mentioned within can be found in our show notes, and please join us for episode 36, where we will continue our conversation with Dr. Aubrey Fine.